No class? Marcia, you were saying there was no class too? I thought Marcia said there would be class. Is there going to be class? Yeah, Marcia says there's class. So, see this lady right here? She's going to be your teacher. Why don't you go with her? Yeah, I'm telling you. Amen. All righty. Bless the Lord. Good seeing everybody. Let freedom ring.
Amen.
This country is a free country, and we have to struggle to keep it free. Many of our founding fathers say it always comes with a cost. We even see in Israel, for them to be free, it came with a cost for them too. After they left Egypt, Israel was ruled by judges, which is hear directly from God what they should and shouldn't do. But eventually the people in Israel decided they wanted a king like other nations. And then that began the downfall of Israel. If they would have stayed with the judges who talked directly to God, they would have been fine. But Israel decided they wanted a king. This is what happens to people when they want to be like the world. When the people are virtuous, when the people are seeking God and they keep their virtue high, freedom will reign. But when virtue starts to come down, then that absolute power of monarchy begins to rise. And they'll eventually cross. And then a king will take what he wants from the people instead of listening to God. We see this in our country today. Virtue is dropping. We've seen all kinds of power elements trying to rise up to control the United States. And most of some form of government control is rising up. And that's a direct result of virtue dropping. In Daniel, we learned that when the transgressors are full, then God will send the king of fierce countenance upon the world. And so it even works there, which will be the beast of Revelation. So as the transgressors are full, which means they can't sin anymore before the eyes of God, then God is going to send a terrible individual upon the earth to wreak havoc on the earth. This is the way it works. Virtue and power work hand in hand in opposite directions. As virtue drops, and many of our founding fathers says too much virtue, you are free and you have freedom. If men stop being moral and having virtue, freedoms will go away. Our founding fathers warned about this, including Benjamin Franklin. We must be a moral country. Democracy as the Supreme Court, Hugo Black said one time, democracy will only work with a moral people. So we start destroying morality, and what is morality? According to the laws of God. He's the one that determines what morality is, not us. We don't determine what's right or wrong. He determines what's right and wrong. So when we follow the commandments of God, that ensures a righteous, moral people. And if we live that way, then democracy will survive. When the people become immoral or lack of virtue, democracy will not survive. Did you know on this day, July 4th, 2 of our past presidents died on the same day at the 50th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence signing? That would be John Adams and Thomas Jefferson. They both died on the exact same day, the same year, July 4th. They both died. And each one was inquiring about the other one as each one was slowly dying and taking the last breath. They were inquiring about the other one. 50 years after the signing of the Declaration of Independence, 50 years in number for Jubilee and freedom. So these two great founding fathers of ours died together on July 4th. But we also know there are other ones. James Monroe, another one of our founding fathers, who was also a president, died on July 4th, 1831, 5 years later after Jefferson and Adams. 5 years later, on July 4th, What are the odds of all that? Our great founding fathers dying like that. James Madison died June 28th, 1836. 60 years earlier, the final draft of the Declaration of Independence was submitted to Congress. So James Madison, the architect of the Constitution, died when the Declaration of Independence was being submitted to the Continental Congress in 1776. Wow. Isn't that amazing? This stuff does not happen chance. These are things that were God's plan right from the beginning as we start seeing these things take place in our history. But do you get taught these kind of things in school? No, you don't. When they began to debate on the Constitution after they won the Revolutionary War, and James Madison, along with others, had finished writing the Constitution, we got in trouble because nobody could get along. They couldn't get along with one another. Just after a war with England, the most powerful country in the world, they couldn't get along. And it looked like it was beginning to collapse the Constitution ourselves. And Benjamin Franklin stood up and made this appeal and this speech in that time when they were getting ready to vote. He said, "In the beginning of the contest with Britain, when we were sensible of danger, we had daily prayers in this room for divine protection. Our prayers, sir, were heard, and they were graciously answered. All of us who were engaged in the struggle must have observed frequent instances of a superintending providence in our favor. To that kind providence, we owe this happy opportunity of consulting in peace on the means of establishing our future national felicity. We have now forgotten, and now have we now forgotten that powerful friend," talking about forgotten God, "or do we imagine we no longer need its assistance? I have lived, sir, a long time, and the longer I live, the more convincing proofs I see of this truth, that God governs the affairs of men, and if a sparrow cannot fall to the ground without his notice, is it probable that an empire can rise without his aid?" Benjamin Franklin said that. And after he said those words, the Continental Congress finally started getting their act together and voted for the Constitution. So another great man, Benjamin Franklin. But what do you learn in school today? Oh, you hear about the terrible stuff that Washington did. You hear about the stuff Jefferson did. You hear about the bad stuff about what Benjamin Franklin did. These men set in course the founding of a country unlike any other country in the world, and neither shall it be again. And then with the Constitution, they brought in the 10 Amendments, known as the Bill of Rights. And the Revolutionary War started April 19, 1775, and it ended September 3rd, 1783. What are some of the things that led up to the Declaration of Independence? You got to understand what the Declaration of Independence was. It was a lot of grievances. It says, whereas England did this and did this and did this against us, we are decided that we are going to rule ourselves and we're going to be independent from England. That's what the Declaration of Independence was all about. It included God in the Declaration of Independence. One of the first things that interfered with the colonists was called the Stamp Act in 1765. This is when England decided to add taxes to paper, and it could only be the paper that was bought from London. Couldn't be any paper bought in the States. It had to be from London. Well, the people rebelled against that. 1767, the Townshend Act, and they put duty taxes on paper, glass, and tea used to pay salaries of governors and judges, and trade regulations, and also to establish the fact that England had a right to tax the colonies. Well, you all remember one of the big events that happened after that? Boston Tea Party. Occurred after that. The people said, oh yeah, we'll teach you. And you had the Boston Tea Party. In 1770, the British troops and the colonists began to fight. And March 5th, 1770, when the first fighting took place, was known as the Boston Massacre. There was a lot of miracles when the war finally broke out. that favored the United States by the providence of God, his favor upon us. God has shed his grace on America. Did you know that every colony, 13 colonies, every colony was founded by a different denomination? Did you know that? Every church, every colony, main religion was a different church. Whether it be the Episcopal or Baptist or Quakers, well, every colony had a different religion it was founded by. So this is why when the Bill of Rights came out, the First Amendment said, "And Congress shall pass no laws to the establishment of a religion," had nothing to do with the way it's interpreted today. Had everything to do with trying to join all 12 colonies together that had their own Protestant or Catholic religion. Maryland was a Catholic colony. Most of the rest of them were Protestant of some form. And each colony was afraid the other colony was going to dominate the federal government. So, the Baptists were afraid that the Quakers were going to find favor, and then the Catholics were afraid that the Puritans were going to find favor. All these things. So they had to come to an agreement so they can live under one government, that federal government was not going to pick a denomination. They're all Christians, and they weren't going to pick a denomination. The way it got interpreted today by evil Supreme Court justices, they make it sound like any religion. It's not any religion. They're all Christian religions. That's what it was about. These founding fathers will roll over in their grave today if they saw that it was being interpreted the way it is today. It was to get all 12 colonies together and make them realize that the federal government wasn't going to favor one denomination over another denomination. That's what that was. So today when people say, oh, you can't do that, separation of church and state, that there's nothing in the church's state concepts in the Constitution or the Declaration of Independence. That was the statement out of a letter from Thomas Jefferson to a Baptist minister who was afraid that the congregational churches were going to take over the Baptist churches in the federal government. And Thomas Jefferson said, no, this is why we have the separation of church and state, to make you all even. It wasn't talking about anything outside of Christianity at all. It was just talking about the congregational Baptist conflict that was taking place at the time. And so today, Supreme Court justices today had determined that anything that's classified as religion must be removed from the state. And what happened when you have those kind of decisions? You have prayer taken out of schools. You have the Ten Commandments, which every one of these denominations upheld, taken out of schools. Totally the opposite. Did you know 11 of the 12 states, it was a requirement that you must be a Christian to run for office. It was a requirement. Does that sound like people who wanted to remove religion from the country? No, just the opposite. But you have the left, you have the progressive people today reinterpreting the laws of this land through wicked judges and changed everything totally different from what it was intended to be. Daniel Webster, a lawyer and statesman, a representative, and a Secretary of State at one time, he said, miracles do not cluster. What has happened once in 6,000 years may not happen again. Hold on to the Constitution, for if the American Constitution should fail, there will be anarchy throughout the world. That was a brilliant man, Daniel Webster. He wrote a lot of good stuff. What do you think the dictionary is named after? Daniel Webster was absolutely right. If the Constitution fails, there will be anarchy. What are you seeing in the streets today? There are people screaming today to abolish the Constitution. They're even calling the Constitution racist and hateful and evil. Daniel Webster is right. If that Constitution goes by the wayside, anarchy will rule. Again, virtue goes down, dictator power will go up. They work hand in hand in the opposite direction. James Wilson in 1787, who signed the Declaration and the Constitution and was appointed to the Supreme Court by George Washington, said this: after a period of years since creation, the United States exhibit to the world the first instance of a nation assembling voluntarily and deciding that the system of government under which they and their posterity should live. So he's saying that never before has there ever been such an experiment as the United States of America. And it has not failed. It needs to be upheld and supported at all times. You know, we know the Roman Empire had senates and representatives too that were kind of based some things off of, but they were not elected by the people. They were appointed, and all those people in the Roman government were aristocrats. But this was elected the day our Constitution and states and electors are by the people and for the people. That's what we have today, unlike anything else. There are other countries that have copied us since then, but even that, their Constitution isn't as strong as our Constitution. And I'm saying this because we need to wake up, because this is hanging by a thread anymore. There are people out there on the left today who want to destroy the Constitution because they don't like what it says. It reminds me of the Psalms. It says that, come, let us break their bonds from us and cast them off of being a nation. What are the bonds talking about? The laws of God. That's what I'm talking about. The restriction of the laws of God. The Constitution was based off the laws of God. And there are people out today who do not want the laws of God restricting them to what they can do, what they want to do. We got people out today who say abolish the police department. Cut their budgets. Abolish them. And we have governors that are agreeing with that and cutting the budgets of police departments and cutting the police departments out. And some of those that's already taken action on those things, their crime rate has gone out the roof. Are they ignorant? Yes. Are they stupid? Yes. Are they foolish? Yes. How can you have a moral people that's not controlled by laws? We're a moral people because we're controlled by the laws of God. You remove those who enforce the laws because you don't like them, because you want the freedom to do all the evil you want. There will be anarchy in this country. Virtue will hit the ground, and anarchy will take over. Wow. The Revolutionary War, when we had the Revolutionary War, it was against the greatest empire in the world. And we defeated the greatest empire in the world. But since the founding of the United States, we have defeated many other empires: Spain, Germany, Japan, communism. We have fed the world. We have brought industry and technology and advanced medical systems to the world. Why do people curse the United States? Why do they curse the United States? Everything has been a blessing to the people that live in the United States. Have we done everything perfectly? No, but we're working on it. We're trying to get there. Anywhere else would be a disaster. Why do you think everybody wants to live here? If they hate us so much in the rest of the world, why are they flocking to our borders? Yeah, man. Calvin Coolidge, the president, in 1924 says, "The history of government on this earth has been almost entirely rule of forever held in the hands of a few. Under the Constitution, America committed itself to power in the hands of the people." And that's the way it should be. We should not ever allow us to be ruled by hands of one or a few. It should be by the people. And today we have wicked judges that are ruling all over the country by few or one or two judges determining what the rest of America, how they should act and live. That's tyranny. The tyranny of the judicial system. Absolute tyranny. And the people need to rise up against these judges that are doing such things, because they're taking the Constitution and the rule of the people away. Constantly you hear, unconstitutional, it's unconstitutional, it's unconstitutional. And I always ask the question, where in the Constitution is that unconstitutional? The people voted for this, and you say it's unconstitutional. Where is it unconstitutional? And they can't ever come up with anything. Or they use really vague things like, well, we have the pursuit of happiness, and this doesn't make people happy. You're making judgment rules over something like that where you totally take and twist a phrase, pursuit of happiness, as a constitutional right, and you override the will of the people? That's what wicked judges do. They like to be gods. They like to play gods. And we have turned everything over to judges today. Did you know that's why it always says when they're writing a decision, it says it is the opinion of the Supreme Court. Supreme Court was only to offer an opinion to Congress. But today we have allowed the Supreme Court to make rules and to rule the country. They were only supposed to make an opinion based off the Constitution back to Congress and the Senate. But instead everybody goes, oh, the Supreme Court says. Supreme Court says. They become like gods. And we need politicians that will support constitutional judges. We've got to do that. We have to, or this nation will cease to exist. In the Revolutionary War, many miracles occurred in the Revolutionary War. When we went against England, it was like David against Goliath. Nobody expected the United States to beat, or what would be the United States to beat England. Nobody. In 1776, the New York harbor was occupied by 400 British ships, 32,000 troops, thousands of wooden masts that looked like forts in the sea, setting out the harbor in New York, coming to do in George Washington and the American Army. They came in with troops. So on the 17th of May, Continental Congress said we're going to approve of a day of prayer. And General William Livingston proposed a day of fasting. He had 100% support in Congress over the day of prayer and the day of fasting. You can't get 100% of Congress today to agree on anything like that today. They're so wicked and so evil. Can you imagine somebody up there saying, I want to institute a day of prayer and fasting. Oh, separation of church and state, you can't do that. Well, the very people who are involved in this are doing it, that formed our Constitution and the Declaration of Independence. There's a bunch more nonsense from the left today. And this is what that proclamation said. We earnestly recommend on the 17th of May be observed as a day of humiliation, fasting and prayer, that we may with united hearts confess and bewail our manifold sins and transgressions, and by a sincere repentance and amendment of life appease God's righteous displeasure, and through the merits and mediation of Jesus Christ obtain his pardon and forgiveness. Can you imagine today a congressperson declaring something like that? They did it constantly during the Revolutionary War. They had a lot of declarations like that. What happened to us? What has happened to us? We forgot God. That's what happened to us. We forgot God. General George Washington ordered that the Continental Congress, having ordered Friday the 17th to be observed as a day of fasting, humiliation, and prayer, humbly to supplicate the mercy of Almighty God, that it would please him to pardon all our manifold sins and transgressions. The general also commanded all officers and soldiers pay strict observance to the orders of the Continental Congress, that by their unfeigned pious observance of the religious duties they may incline the Lord, a giver of the victory, to prosper our arms. George Washington said this to the troops as you saw the British ships sailing into the New York harbor. They knew they were in for a really bad battle taking place at that time. As a matter of fact, George Washington wrote to his younger brother and said, we expect a very bloody summer of it at New York. We are not either in man or arms prepared for it. If our cause is just, and I do most religiously believe it is to be, the same providence which has in many instances appeared for us will still go on to afford its aid. So George Washington wrote his younger brother just before that battle of New York Harbor began, which was the biggest and largest battle of the Revolutionary War, that he was telling his brother, we're calling upon God for his aid. George Washington was not only the man of the hour, he was a man of the century. Did you know he fought with the British in the French Indian Wars? And the Indians fighting with the French wondered who this guy was, sitting out there on his horse, and nobody can kill him. His cloak, George Washington always had a cloak, was full of bullet holes, yet no bullet ever struck him. And they shot his horse out from underneath him twice. And these Indians, particularly the Mohawk Indians, going, who is this guy? He's destined for greatness. We can't kill him. I got him right in my sights, and I can't kill him. I can't hit him. What's going on here? George Washington was covered. He probably had angels deflecting bullets everywhere. George Washington was the man of the century to make sure that our government was going to stand against England. Did you know when the English attacked our capital at that time, Philadelphia, the Continental Congress fled, and before they fled, they said, George Washington, you're in charge about everything. Do whatever you want to do. And they took off. So the whole thing was put on George Washington's shoulder immediately to determine the fate of the United States at that time. How would you like to have that on your shoulders, huh? Man, wow. When the Declaration was signed on July 4th in 1776, they sent a copy to George Washington, and George Washington read the Declaration of Independence to his troops just before we had the New York Harbor battle. And you know the Declaration of Independence mentions God 4 times? God. One time it says the laws of nature and of nature's God is in the Declaration of Independence. Another time it says all men are created equal, that they're endowed by the Creator with certain unalienable rights. That phrase right there, that we have certain rights, is the most profound statement of any government document. That recognizes that each human being has certain rights under God. Not kings, not dictators, but each individual person has certain rights under God that must be upheld. That has never been heard of anywhere in 6,000 years of government on this earth. Do you think these people weren't inspired by God when they wrote these things? Another thing is appealing to the supreme judge of the world for the rectitude of our intention. Referring again to God again. Reliance on the protection of divine providence. Another statement in the Declaration of Independence. So when people say, oh, God's not mentioned in our Constitution or Declaration of Independence, they've never read it. They have never read it. They don't have any clue about what was said and not said. Wow. There was a British loyalist. If you know what a loyalist was, they were the ones that were loyal to England and living in America. They were called loyalists. And they were traitors. They showed a path for the British to come around and attack Washington on that Staten Island in a different direction to overcome him. So they had traitors you have to worry about at all times, coming and going. So they came up behind Washington from behind. The English did, because of this loyalist who showed a pathway through the forest. You know, you got to remember, Staten Island was a forest at one time, not buildings like it is today. And so they showed the English to how to come around and attack Washington from behind. If the American army would have been destroyed on Staten Island, the Revolutionary War would have been over with almost immediately. The first battle, it had been all over with. 3,000 Americans died in that battle and only 300 British. The 1st Maryland Regiment had 400 men, and they charged right into the British lines 6 times. Why were they charged into the British lines 6 times? To allow the rest of them to escape. These men gave their lives to those rest of the soldiers so they can escape the British cannon and gunfire. Dedicated men who loved God and saw the freedoms were necessary in this country gave their lives up to allow the American army to escape. That same story has been repeated over and over and over again in all our wars of dedicated Americans fighting for this country. You don't see that in other countries. You don't see it. So 8,000 Americans were trapped against the sea by British General Howe on the Brooklyn Heights. So Washington at night put a call out across the East River to anybody who has a boat, come and ferry American soldiers to the other side. And people answered that call. Every size of boat you can imagine was coming across the East River at night and ferrying American soldiers to the other side to get away from the British Army. Kind of reminds you of the evacuation of Dunkirk in World War I. But all these fellow Americans, every kind of boat they had, they came across that river and started ferrying back and forth all night long American troops so they would not be destroyed by the English. When it got to be morning and the sun was coming up, a fog came in. A fog came in that was so dense that you could not see 6 feet beyond. And the rest of the American soldiers were ferried off that land, and George Washington ordered the campfires to continue to be burning so the British would think they were still there. So finally, when the last soldier left Staten Island, which was George Washington, he was the last one to go. Tell you what kind of leader that man was. He was the last one to go. Then the fog cleared and the English attacked and there was nobody there. They were all gone. So America would continue to fight another day. Otherwise, the entire Revolutionary War could have ended right there. Matter of fact, Major Ben Talmadge said this, I recollect this peculiar providential occurrence, something by God, perfectly well, and so very dense was the atmosphere that I could scarcely discern a man at 6 yards distance. We tarried until the sun had risen, but the fog remained as dense as ever. Where'd that fog suddenly come from, such a dense fog? Well, God. God protected our troops so they could get out at that time. Matter of fact, George Washington said later, the hand of providence has been so conspicuous in all the course of the war, that he must be worse than an infidel that lacks faith. But it will be time enough for me to turn preacher when my present appointment ceases. So Washington was so impressed by the hand of God moving constantly, he's saying, when I am done being the general, I'm going to be a preacher. Instead, he became president instead. But I'm sure he did a little preaching while he was president. Wow. In 6 months' time from the British invasion, Washington's men went from 20,000 to 2,000 men. He didn't have much to fight with. Because a lot of these people were only volunteered for a certain length of time, and then they said after their length of time, we're leaving. So Washington was offering an extension for his men, an extra month. If you just stay an extra month, I'll give you $10. $10 to stay an extra month. So he tried to convince his men to stay, but only 2,000 stayed. Wow. Washington had this read to his men from Thomas Paine, called The American Crisis. These are the times that try men's souls. The summer soldier and the sunshine patriot will, in this crisis, shrink from the service of our country. Tyranny like hell is not easily conquered, yet we have this consolation with us, that the harder the conflict, the more glorious the triumph. Heaven knows how to put a proper price upon its goods, and it would be a strange indeed if so celestial an article as freedom should be not highly rated. He told his men those things. How true it is. They talked about the summer soldier and the sunshine patriot. Those people who like to be a patriot when things are well will run the other direction when things get hard. The summer soldier, the only one that's hired for a certain amount of time, then I'm out of here. So Washington talked about these kind of people and told his men, we're not looking for people like that. We're looking for true patriots. A true patriot will stay to the end even when times are hard. That's a true patriot. You live in freedom today because of these true patriots that took place. The next battle that was occur was when you've all aware of and seen pictures and paintings of it, where Washington defeated the German Hussians by crossing the Delaware River in the winter on Christmas Day. A sneak attack. Washington was able to go after these German mercenaries in a secret attack, and he defeated them in Trenton. After the battle on December 26, 1776, Washington had declared victory. Later, Washington left Trenton and came up behind a British group fighting at Princeton, and he defeated them too at Princeton. So after being chased out of New York Harbor, Washington had two quick victories against the German mercenaries and against the English soldiers also at that point, which is later the area was known as Princeton after that. 800 British soldiers were captured as a result. Let me tell you about captured soldiers in them days. George Washington always let his captives go free. The English, more American prisoners died on English ships and prisons than died in the war. That's how brutal England was to our men. But George Washington was not brutal to the British. That probably helped, because a lot of those men did not want to come back and fight the Americans because they knew how rough the British were. And so George Washington let us go. We could have died in those prisons, and he let us go. That takes the wind out of their sails. It probably was a good move by Washington. So Washington had a surprise move on the British enemy at Princeton, and he won that battle. The Yale president, Ezra Stiles, said, "The United States are under a peculiar obligation to become a holy people unto the Lord our God." This Harvard president realized there is a special anointing on the United States. There's a special calling on the United States. Too bad Yale doesn't think that way anymore, nor Princeton, nor Harvard. They think the opposite today. They're doing great evil today, those universities. But they were Christian seminary universities that taught men the truth and the right history at one time. Shortly after that battle, we had the Battle of Saratoga. 6,000 British came down from Canada to attack George Washington. And they brought with them the Mohawk Indians. And they paid the Mohawk Indians for scalps. So you get scalps, we'll give you guns and money and whatever else you want. So just start creating terror across the colonies. So the Mohawk Indians came down and started creating terror. The problem was the Indians could not differentiate between British loyalists and American colonists. So they started showing up with scalps of all kinds of people. What really was a bad thing is one of the commanders had a blonde-headed girlfriend. And when the Indians came in to get their rewards, one of the Indians was carrying the scalp of his girlfriend. Well, this isn't working out like we thought it should be. So they told the Indians, "Stop doing that, you don't know the difference." And it made the Indians mad, so the Indians left. All right, fine, we're out of here. So the Mohawks left, not until after they had the British deep into the forests of New York, and they didn't know how to get out. Washington did, and Washington attacked this British force and captured all 6,000 of the British people when the Indians abandoned them. You don't think that's from God? Stuff like that happens? It's from God? Wow. Unbelievable. Right after that victory in Saratoga, the Continental Congress declared the first Thanksgiving as a national holiday to be thankful to God for the victory to the merits of Jesus Christ. You think our first national holiday was just to give thanks for what the Pilgrims did? The first Thanksgiving was to be thanks to God for victory at Saratoga with George Washington. That's what that was about. Wow. George Washington directed his men to go to church on Sundays. To the distinguished character of patriots, it should be our highest glory to laud the more distinguished character of a Christian. So George Washington was always putting religion and God in the forefront and telling all his men to have the character a Christian is supposed to have. He was telling his men this all the time. Then you have somebody like Benedict Arnold. You ever heard of Benedict Arnold? That man almost cost us the Revolutionary War. Benedict Arnold. He was the commander at West Point. And he was upset that he did not get more credit for the Battle of Saratoga, that he turned on the Americans and told the British he will turn the American army and George Washington over to them at West Point. The British agreed. All right, you do this thing, we'll be forever grateful. So they sent a carrier with the information from Benedict Arnold, what's getting ready to happen, to the British commanders so they'll be ready to take West Point. When this carrier was going through the woods and got stopped by American soldiers. When they started searching him, they realized the guy was very nervous and he was hiding something. So they made him take his boots off. Inside his boot was a letter indicating to the British generals that Benedict Arnold will turn over West Point to them on such and such particular date, that they had to have their forces in line in order to capture Washington with his treasonous sneak attack. That's providence. God had a hand in this. That one action alone could have cost the United States. As a matter of fact, George Washington said this: General Arnold was about to give American cause a deadly wound, if not a fatal stab. Happily, the treason has been timely discovered to prevent the fatal misfortune. The providential train of circumstances which led to its discovery affords the most convincing proof that the liberties of America are object of divine protection. What are the odds of the American soldiers capturing some guy walking through the woods, looks like anybody else? But they stopped and checked him and found out it was a traitor. So then George Washington offered the British that spy for return of Benedict Arnold. They refused. So George Washington hung the spy. So the spy was hung. Wow. Afterwards, on October 18, 1780, another day of Thanksgiving was proclaimed by the Continental Congress. And they said this remarkable interposition of his watchful providence in the rescuing the person of our commander-in-chief and army from imminent danger from the moment when treason was ripened for execution. So they had another proclaimed day of Thanksgiving, thanking God for the revealing of this treasonous act to protect George Washington and our army. Wow, why don't we see things like that today? We don't see things like that today. Wow, man. So the battle continues. You ever heard of the Battle of Cowpens? You ever seen the movie The Patriot? That was the Battle of Cowpens. Again, divine protection. The American forces sent a small group of ragtag loyalists or patriots out there to fire at the huge British army that was coming, and they were all commanded to fire 3 shots. Stay, hold your ground, and fire 3 shots. At the 3rd shot, run. So they all, bam, you're talking about, powder and muskets, it takes time to reload. Shot 3 times, and then this group of patriots ran for their lives over the hill. And of course, at that time, the British general says, charge with their elite army, chase them down and kill every one of them. So as the British elite forces came over the hill, they were staring down right at the American army. They got mowed down. The British got mowed down at that point. Pretty good trick. But that's the way they had to think in them days. It reminds me of the battle Israel had against so many enemies. Divine protection, so many ways that God protected Israel when they were outnumbered, outforced, and outarmed. And Israel still won those battles because they evoked the name of God. And this is what happened here too. But then the American army had to run because Cornwallis was coming up behind with a larger force. So Cornwallis started chasing the Americans, and the Americans were running for their lives. And the Americans crossed 3 rivers in the process of trying to get away from Cornwallis. And every case, when they crossed the river, a flash flood came in and stopped Cornwallis and the British Army. In one case, this guy had written about that the river lowered its level until the American army got across and then picked back up again. And even that British guy writing about that says, this sounds like something from God. He couldn't believe it. Kind of remind me of the Hebrews crossing the Red Sea concept. God intervened in the Revolutionary War over and over and over again. Wow. You don't think this country was founded on divine principles? Yes, it was. So eventually, Cornwallis threw all his supplies off and trying to speed up his army, trying to chase this American army. So wagons and everything were left behind as he's chasing the American army. Finally gets to Yorktown. He gets to Yorktown, he doesn't have any more supplies. So he calls on his navy to come up that river by Yorktown to bring in supplies. Well, about that time, the French Navy showed up and blockaded the harbor. So he could not get supplies. Meanwhile, fog rolled in, rain started pouring down, and George Washington came from the north, came down and got right up to Yorktown within shooting distance. In the fog and the rain, they never saw him coming. And they built their embankments for the cannons and everything else. And when the sun finally came out, the American artillery opened fire on the British, and the British tried to flee in small boats. But then a storm came up and sunk the small boats in the river. It was not a good day for the British. So Cornwallis surrendered. He was so embarrassed he had his lieutenants surrender. He gave his sword to the lieutenants to give to George Washington. He himself would not come out and surrender to George Washington. He was so embarrassed. You can't fight against God. And this is what we saw in the Revolutionary War, one miracle after another, with the providence of God forming this country. This country has had difficult times and still will continue having difficult times. But if the people of this country will evoke the name of the Lord and pray and fast, we will succeed. We'll exceed with the problems we're having today. We will succeed. God is more than able to take something that looks horrible and turn it into something good. As I've heard before, so if you got lemons, make lemonade. God knows how to make lemonade. He will watch after us if we watch after Him, by believing in Him and trusting in Him and standing for God in our nation, in our Constitution. This is just one in many, many stories of our existence. When you start adding all the other battles and wars the United States has fought for liberty of people in other countries, that men gave their lives for others. Why is that? Why do Americans give their lives for other countries? Because once you've tasted freedom, you want everybody to have freedom. You become addicted to freedom. You like the taste of freedom. And you desire everybody to have freedom also. That's why Americans give their lives even fighting in other countries. We did it in our own countries, our own country, and we have done for others. God help us if we ever turn from God and learn that God's providence is on the hand of the United States unless we turn our back on him. And we've been doing our best to try to turn our back on him. But like 2 Chronicles 7:13 and 14 says, particularly 14, if my people, which are called by my name, shall humble themselves and turn from their wicked ways, then I will heal their land. God's just asking his people to do that. He's not asking for others that don't know him. He's asking if his people would do that. Just his people would turn from their ways and acknowledge him. Then he will be a fortress for us. He'll be a strength for us. A strength that cannot be broken. He will be our defense that cannot be breached. That's what he has promised when you trust in him at all times. Amen?
Amen.
Time for offerings.